Our speaker this evening is Professor David Engelsma. He has served Christ as a minister in the Protestant Reformed churches for some 47 years and authored during that time also many articles and books. He has served pastorates in both Loveland, Colorado and South Holland, Illinois. In 1988, he took up his work in the Protestant Reformed Seminary, where he was professor of Old Testament studies and dogmatics. He retired from that position in 2008 and continues to be busy writing, teaching, lecturing, and preaching. We welcome him tonight to speak to us on the theme Federal Vision, Unconditional Covenant, and the Reformation's Gospel of Grace. Professor Engelsma.
Thank you, Reverend Overway. Reformed brothers and sisters and co-heirs of the riches of the gospel that God gave to us through the 16th century Reformation of the Church. I am grateful to the Reformed Witness Committee for the invitation to be with you tonight and this weekend. For one thing, it gives me the opportunity to meet again old friends. And I have noticed that many of these friends are indeed old by this time. This friendship began to be formed when I entered the ministry in 1963, and 1963 was a long time ago. I also welcome the opportunity, I count it as a privilege, to preach for Hull and for Calvary this coming Lord's Day, God willing. But I am especially grateful for the invitation to speak on the subject that was announced by Reverend Overway. I regard the development in the Reformed churches that I will address tonight as one of the gravest threats to the Reformed faith and to the Reformed churches since the Synod of Dort in the early 17th century. And there is the closest connection between the false doctrine that is entrenched in and spreading in the conservative, Reformed, and Presbyterian churches and the Synod of Dort. The great issue before the Reformed churches today is whether the doctrines of God's sovereign grace apply to God's saving work in the covenant. Yes or no? The answer that is given by the heresy that is spreading in the churches, that which calls itself the Federal Vision, answers that question no. And if that is the case, the Synod of Dort is overthrown in its entirety. I believe that regardless of the speakers, the warning and instruction that I give tonight ought to be given up and down the land of all Reformed and Presbyterian churches in North America, for the preservation of the Reformed faith, which is God's own gospel, and for the salvation of the children and the grandchildren of those who today confess that they are Reformed and Presbyterian believers. I am glad to be able to speak on the subject that I now bring to you tonight. The Federal Vision is a theology, a body of teachings within the conservative, Reformed, and Presbyterian churches in North America. The Federal Vision denies all of the doctrines of sovereign grace, centering on justification by faith alone, the heart of the gospel and the heart of the 16th century Reformation of the Church. The Federal Vision is favorable to a broader theological movement known as the New Perspective on Paul, which dismisses the Reformation's understanding of the gospel, especially in Romans and in Galatians, as mistaken. The Federal Vision is furthered by a widespread promotion of biblical theology at the expense of systematic theology, which is a veiled attack upon the creeds, especially the Canons of Dort and the Westminster Standards. The Federal Vision I regard as one of the most deadly and dangerous threats to the gospel of grace that was restored to the Church in the 16th century by the great movement of the Reformation. Briefly, the historical background of the theology and movement within conservative Reformed and Presbyterian churches in North America that calls itself the Federal Vision is this. In the year 2000, that is 10 years ago, Norman Shepherd published a book entitled The Call of Grace. At that time, he was a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. Although for much of his career earlier, he had been a theologian in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, serving as professor of systematic theology in Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. In that book, Shepherd openly and explicitly attacked all of the doctrines of sovereign grace that are confessed by the Reformed creeds, especially the Canons of Dort and the Westminster Confession of Faith. On the foreground in that book, although not at the heart of that book, was the denial of justification by faith alone. Shepherd taught that justification is by faith and by the good works that faith produces. I am not going to take time tonight to document these observations concerning Shepherd's attack on all of the doctrines of grace and concerning the Federal Vision's denial of all of the doctrines of sovereign grace, because that is not my purpose tonight. I have documented these observations with quotations from the men of the Federal Vision themselves in my book, The Covenant of God and the Children of Believers, Sovereign Grace in the Covenant. And besides that, Shepherd's book, The Call of Grace, is readily available to everyone. The publication of Shepherd's book in the year 2000 was the occasion of the opening of the floodgates of public defense of Shepherd's teachings and aggressive promotion of Shepherd's teachings within many of the conservative, Reformed, and Presbyterian churches in North America, including the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church in America, and the United Reformed Churches. The result in the past 10 years has been a spate of writings in books and periodicals, high-level colloquiums or conferences, church decisions on concrete cases, reports of study committees, and, I am told, interminable discussion on the Internet. Virtually all of the conservative Reformed churches have had to concern themselves, and many of them at their church assemblies, with the theology of the Federal Vision. For this is what the advocates of the doctrines published by Shepherd call their distinct theology, the Federal Vision. At this point, I call attention only to one aspect of their name for their theology and movement, that which is the most important. It is a theology about the covenant. Federal, from the Latin word fidus, means covenant. The federal vision is a heresy. It is a stubborn, persistent, deliberate departure from and denial of a cardinal truth of Scripture, as that cardinal truth of Scripture is rightly and authoritatively confessed in the Reformed creeds. Specifically, the federal vision is heretical with regard to the doctrine that it itself puts on the foreground, the doctrine of justification. Whereas the creeds teach justification by faith alone, the federal vision is teaching justification by faith and by works. Already in 1976, it is now revealed, Shepherd informed his authorities in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and at Westminster Seminary that he taught that, and now I quote Shepherd, to insist on justification by faith alone for justification is a serious impoverishment, end of quote. Shepherd added that it is possible to lose the grace of justification, which of course is true if justification is partly by our own good works. And he also taught that it is possible for justification to be increased and to decrease. And that, of course, is impossible if the righteousness of justification is the perfect obedience of Christ, as indeed it is. For to the righteousness of Christ nothing can be added, and from the righteousness of Christ nothing can be subtracted. In fact, this teaching concerning justification is the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, which the Reformation of the 16th century condemned, and this doctrine of justification as taught by the federal vision is the doctrine of justification that is condemned by the book of Romans, especially in chapters 3 through 5 and in the entire epistle to the Galatians. I quote, "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law," end quote. Romans 3, verse 28. And again, quote, "No man is justified by the law in the sight of God, for the just shall live by faith," end quote. Galatians 3, verse 11. The federal vision's doctrine of justification flatly contradicts question and answer 60 of the Heidelberg Catechism. Quote, "How art thou righteous before God? Only by a true faith in Jesus Christ." End of quote. The federal vision doctrine of justification contradicts as well question and answer 62 of the Heidelberg Catechism. Quote, "Why cannot our good works be the whole or part of our righteousness before God?" End of quote. With the answer that follows, which answer points out that whereas God demands perfect obedience, even our best works are defiled with sin and therefore cannot be even the slightest part of our righteousness with God. The federal vision's denial of justification by faith alone is the denial of the gospel of grace